I'm sure you've heard of this word as well, as the false self, right? That there's a false self, but again, compensatory, because you said we all need that. We need to know that we matter and that we're important to somebody, but that somebody feels, that we get a response from somebody. And one way to get a response then is what? Overperforming. Yeah.
Yes. And what I've seen though with a lot of people with the narcissistic trait in that regard, it's not just overperforming to please you to get love. What ends up happening though is because there's this, you can't differentiate between yourself and the other person actually becomes more of an object and a possession versus an actual human being in the relationship.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's key.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I'm joined by Kamini Wood, a certified coach who works with high achievers recovering from burnout, self-doubt, and narcissistic relationship dynamics. Drawing on trauma-informed practices, she helps individuals rebuild self-trust and communicate with clarity. Kamini is also the original author of How Does Someone Become a Narcissist? Early Signs and Root Causes, which is actually how I first came across her work. But beyond that, it was her writing and her podcast on narcissistic dynamics that helped shape the direction of the conversation I'm going to share with you today. In this first part of my conversation, we're taking a deeper look at narcissism, moving beyond how the term is often used in everyday language. Have you ever wondered whether you or someone you love is struggling with narcissistic traits, or perhaps something more deeply rooted within the personality structure? In this episode, we explore that question while also tracing how narcissism can develop. We cover a lot more. I'm really excited to share this with you, so let's get right into my conversation with Kamini. Hello, Kamini. Thank you so much for joining us on the Narcissism Decoder. We're so excited to have you here today to talk about narcissism.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here with you.
Great. Maybe what we could do is, before we get into how narcissism develops, because I know that's something we want to discuss, maybe we could just lay a little bit of groundwork. And you could tell me, in terms of narcissism, how do you typically define it? Like in your mind, what is narcissism? And I think that will lend a nice structure also to something we want to talk about is what's the difference between narcissistic traits and someone who has a more ingrained personality disorder?
Yes. So I would say, first and foremost, each one of us as human beings have the capacity to have what I refer to as some narcissistic traits. I mean, I think we all go through stages of, I think, even adolescence. For instance, I work with some parents and I coach parents around the teenagers. And I usually say, like, hey, they're the most narcissistic individuals that we have. Most individuals will grow out of it. It's because they're exhibiting a lot of traits around self-centeredness and ego-driven behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. What I would say is, while some of us have narcissistic traits at moments, what I look towards is the people who are, it's part of their pattern and practice of constantly showing up in this self-focused way, in this validation seeking, almost for some people it's grandiose, some people have vulnerable narcissism, but it's those traits that are patterned and they're there most often. Now, NPD itself is a very clinical diagnosis. And so trained therapists have to go through a certain, it's not a questionnaire, but it's a criteria that they go through to actually diagnose narcissism. So in my line of work, I don't diagnose people with narcissism. That's not I'm a coach, not a therapist. However, when I work with individuals, and most often I'm working with individuals who are recovering from a narcissistic dynamic, it's with individuals that they have been in some type of a relationship. It could be workplace, it could be romantic, it could be parent, it could be child, or they have dealt with somebody who has exhibited that pattern practice of the consistent self-focus, constantly seeking validation. You end up in these trauma bonds with them because there's just a cycle that happens when you're in a relationship with somebody with narcissistic personality traits. I think for me, it's less about the label and it's more about how is this person showing up and their capacity to self-reflect.
Yes. So I'll just jump in with a couple of thoughts that I had as I was listening and get your opinion on this. So one of the first things that I heard in, I'm a psychoanalyst by training, and one of the things that we talk about, it's in the literature going way back, I think even Sigmund Freud wrote about a primary narcissistic phase of development. Like there were phases of development, not stages, but one of the earliest ones after what he called autoerotism, which has been sort of debunked because they do show like the infant is engaging like right from the beginning of life. But his second phase of development is actually called narcissism. I see what you mean there, that there's a certain level of development that's expected, in terms of what we call primary narcissism. So that was one thought I had. And the second one was, and I just wanted to check with you, there are many different ways that people define narcissism. And I think what I was hearing from your definition is, so someone who has narcissistic traits may be a little bit more flexible. There's not such a rigidity in terms of the way they relate to other people or the way they experience themselves. One thing that I tend to think about with narcissism, and I'm curious to get your opinion, is how rigid, like how ossified, how stuck are they in terms of the way they relate, the way they see themselves and others? And then is there any level and very little level of fluidity there, that they have specific ways of seeing the world that it's hard to sort of shake that up? I don't know if you think about it that way as well.
Well, I think about a lot of things on a spectrum. And so I think even this is part of that spectrum, right? Somebody could have narcissistic personality traits, but they're on the part of the spectrum where they have some capacity for some self-reflection. However, there are a lot of narcissists that don't have that, right? They don't have the capacity for empathy. They don't have the capacity for self-reflection. Those are key in my line of work, and just how I've seen people show up. Those are key if they're going to make some changes. And so while I'd love to say that everybody has the capacity to change, I have definitely had clients who are in dynamics. Their partner is so down the other end of the spectrum where there's such a lack of the ability to self-reflect, and there's just such a lack of any type of empathy beyond cognitive empathy that I struggle to see where that's going to change, because the truth is nobody's going to change unless they want to change. And if it's always the other person that needs to change, or it's always the other person's fault, there's not a whole lot that can be done there. So
Yeah.
that's how I...
Yeah, and that's very typical, like part of any personality disorder, not just narcissism, is there's typically an externalization. So it's always your fault. It's never my fault. I'm not responsible for any of the conflict that's going on, either at work or in my relationship. So in terms of thinking of somebody who has more of these narcissistic traits or characteristics, as compared to the other end of the spectrum, let's say, someone who has NPD, or more of the personality disorder, I like to just really ground it for my listeners. Let's play around with an example. I could give one, or if you have an example in mind, we could talk about how that would look differently for someone who has traits compared to a narcissistic personality disorder. I'm happy to give one if you like, or I'm happy to listen to one.
Well, I know that for me, I'm working with a client right now, and right now her partner's exhibiting some pretty strong traits around the fact that, everything is her fault. She routinely gets gaslit into thinking that she's being overly sensitive, or quite frankly, that she's overreacting to situations. And she has hope that that there's a willingness there. But what we've been coaching around is we don't control how the other person shows up, and we don't control what they're willing to do. Now, I can see a through line that this person does have based on what she shares with me. I have not worked with him, but what she shared with me is that he has moments, these glimmers of having compassion and empathy. And if he's willing to lean into that, right now, I think he's so scared of being vulnerable, right? And that's part of the narcissistic traits, that what happens is like you're so scared, there's so much shame involved, and the fear of vulnerability based on previous experiences. He's so afraid to go there. That's what's keeping them stuck in this pattern. So that's an example that I'd say, like, hey, he's not all the way at the other end of the spectrum. He's edging his way there if he would be willing to do that work. She can't make him do it, though. Meantime, she's actually, and I don't mean to cut you off, but what's hard is watching her get smaller and smaller in the context of this dynamic, because she's very committed to making the relationship work.
I see that too. And one of the things you mentioned was really valuable in my mind is, so you could see moments, like where he may be a little bit more engaged, a little bit more empathic, or a little more understanding. That's something I talk about very frequently on this podcast, is when you're working with these individuals, they have moments. Sometimes I call them micro moments, because they come and go so quickly, because to your point, that's vulnerability or dependency, depending on somebody else to really understand. Like if you have a moment, will somebody be there to understand you? Well, actually, this is a nice transition, because we wanted to talk about development, right? And this was part of your article. One of the things I read, one of your articles, is what causes narcissistic traits or characteristics, like what leads up to this. So maybe this could be a nice transition into what actually does happen in early development. Because what I was just about to mention to you is there's a micro moment, then they have them where they are more related, but they're so terrified. And then I was going to say, so they pull back and they return to what we call the grandiose structure. That's the structure that holds them together. But what's happened, in your own opinion, developmentally, that they're so terrified of vulnerability or dependency or even envy, however you conceptualize it? I'm curious to hear more about that.
What I've learned through my work is that a lot of things can be traced back to just our childhood. And it's not to
Mm.
say that everything is traced back to some big traumatic event. When we think about children, they are sponges. They are so adaptable. They are taking in experiences and messages that they're receiving and they are making meaning of them. I mean, as humans, our brains are meaning making machines, right? And it starts from a very early age. So, what happens with younger children is, if they are having an experience of disconnection, they're asking themselves, well, what version of me gets connection? What version of me gets the approval? What version of me feels safe? And then they adapt to being that version, right? So if they grow up in an environment where vulnerability is not safe, as an example, those emotions are dismissed, or love feels conditional, or their worth is tied to performing in a certain way. Yes, that sometimes shows up. It's different traits, like sometimes it's people pleasing and perfectionism and things like that. But sometimes it takes this realm of grandiosity, some type of superiority, because vulnerability is too scary, right? So we take on and we
Mm.
adapt this other perspective of grandiosity
Mhm.
and, that self-focusedness, because I need to survive. And how do I do that? I'm self-focused, right? And so that's where I had been tracing back a lot of where this starts from, if we're going to
Yeah.
try to say, okay, we're create some understanding of where this could potentially be birthed.
So what actually happens then? I mean, what goes on in such early development where they begin to feel? Because another definition of narcissism is the whole structure is compensatory, means it's a defense against these early vulnerabilities. But what actually goes on in early childhood that leaves them feeling? You mentioned shame and vulnerability, but what actually happens?
I think it traces back to, like, the attachment style that they're exposed to, right? If
Mm.
things feel insecure or things, or even some avoidant attachment style, I think that contributes to it. I do think that a big player is conditional. If love
Mm.
is conditional versus
Mm.
unconditional. And as human beings, it's really hard to get to this fully 100% unconditional aspect. I just want to put that out there because I mean, I'm a mom of 5 and I will routinely say I love my kids unconditionally. And then there's moments where it's not that I don't love them, but there are moments where I've caught myself,
Yeah.
putting conditions on something and I'm like, oh, I did not mean that. But see, I'm putting in the effort to repair.
Oh, wait, wait. Just a condition can be something like what? If you don't do this, then there's a punishment. Is that like a condition, or
That
there's no?
that's an
Mm.
example. That's an example. Or I conditionally, as long as you are performing and you are, getting your straight A's, or you're the top player on your sports team, then you get my attention and my
Mm.
affection. But
I s-
without that, I kind of don't pay attention to you. It's not that
Yes.
I'm not saying I don't love you and I'm berating you, but I'm also not connecting with you. And we know from the research that quality connections is what we need. Like, we as human
Yeah.
beings need to know we matter. I mean, if
Mm.
you think about that, our children absolutely need to know that they matter. And
Yeah.
mattering goes two ways, right? Mattering says, I feel valued and also I am bringing value.
Mm.
So there's that twofold that happens in that construct, right? And so
Mm.
if you're in an environment as a child and it doesn't feel safe, or it feels that I can only gain love and affection if I'm performing this way, well, then of course this is where some of these traits start to build up and start
Yeah.
to accumulate.
You just made me think we started with a definition of narcissism. I'm sort of circling, like, this is like a circular conversation. We could build on it. It's like reiterative. Let's go back just for a moment because you mentioned if they don't get the highest grades or they're not performing at the highest level on the team, right?
Mhm.
That there may be a withdrawal of love. And that reminded me, that's a whole nother definition of narcissism is they have a problem with self-other differentiation. In other words, where do I begin or where does the other person end? You know, and in this case, if you have a parent like that, yeah, naturally, well, you could go a couple of different ways, but one way is that you're going to work very hard, I would imagine, to please them. Well, the other is you're going to rebel. And then you have different clusters of narcissistic presentations, which we could talk about maybe at some point. But if you're pleasing them, that's the beginning. And I'm sure you've heard of this word as well as the false self, right? That there's a false self. But again, compensatory, because you said we all need that, we need to know that we matter and that we're important to somebody, but that somebody feels, that we get a response from somebody. And one way to get a response then is what? Overperforming. Yeah.
Yes. And what I've seen though with a lot of people with the narcissistic trait in that regard, it's not just overperforming to please you to get love. What ends up happening though is because there's this, you can't differentiate between yourself and the other person actually becomes more of an object and a possession
Mhm.
versus an actual human being in the relationship.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's key.
Yeah. So that what you're getting into then is a certain level of control, right? That One way to possess another is to control them. Yeah, and you see a lot of this around separations, even the separations of everyday life. If they're leaning more towards the narcissistic, not just the traits, because this is a trait, but they can't allow the other person to separate. So you see this at times when they're, maybe the other one is going out with their girlfriend, for dinner or something like that. It's not always a one-to-one, but, they'll come in and report that there was a big fight. And then when you trace that backwards, sometimes what you find is that inevitably the fight occurred before a major separation. And a major separation is something as simple as, like I said, going out with your girlfriends on a Friday night or having a different opinion, something that's, yeah.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Yep. And I'm glad that you brought that up because sometimes it's not a physical separation. Sometimes it's a thought separation. And I talk about this even in boundaries work is we can set boundaries around our thoughts. Like my thoughts are my
Yes.
thoughts and I'm allowed to have them. But in that, what you just said is really important for us to name is that can happen too. There's a separation in thought and the other person cannot handle that.
Yeah. So I think what we start to slowly see based on the development that you gave us, right, is it's not like there's one event that's like the big T trauma, right? It could be a number of very significant misattunements. Like there's a lack of attunement, emotional attunement or affective resonance, where a parent doesn't necessarily, they're not on the same page. They don't see things the same way. They don't appreciate the child's emotions in the way that the child needs that. So slowly what happens is this all gets internalized, right? And then, and this is to your point a little while ago, is why it's so hard when we start thinking about change, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation. But because this isn't just a defense against something, like the whole dismissive, grandiose, controlling quality, but it's like a structure. It's like the way that it's part of their personality now. And that's also why it's so pervasive and cuts across many different areas of life. I mean, if you just take someone who, is functioning at a very high level in their job, and then suddenly a new boss comes in, that requires a certain level of adapting because maybe this boss doesn't support them, acknowledge them, see them, hold them in the same regard as the old boss, right, who was removed for whatever reason. So now you begin to see, is this narcissistic traits or a structure depending on how do they deal? Can they adapt to change circumstances?
I'm so agreeing with what you're saying because that distinction that you're making, is it traits or is it personality? And I think, and when I mentioned before earlier about that spectrum, when we go further onto that side of the spectrum, now we're more into personality versus just traits. Because again, each one of us have moments of having certain traits pop up.
Yes.
Right? It depends on the pervasiveness of it and the depth of it and how we're showing up. And what you just said, our adaptability.
Yeah. So someone who has the traits, I would imagine, would say, this new boss is not supportive like my old boss, and this hurts. And they could even experience them as being critical. And there might be what we call narcissistic slights, but they're not major narcissistic slights. So what that allows them to do is slowly begin to learn how to adapt to the changed circumstances, whatever that is. I'm just using the boss as an example. Whereas someone who has more of the personality structure, what you'll see is what? They'll become very defensive. They'll become guarded. They'll start to criticize back to the people that you mentioned, like that you work with people like who are in these relationships. And I'm sure you hear this quite a bit, right? That they get criticized, they get judged, they get dismissed, they get devalued. Those are all indications, stronger indications. Now you're dealing with something much more entrenched.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. The demeaning when you start, right? They start showing up in a very demeaning way.
Yes.
Those are all big indicators.
Yeah, because look, any change circumstances are difficult. I mean, they're difficult for all of us, but we have to figure out a way to adapt. But again, with someone who has more of the structure, that's what they lose out on because, again, remember we said this earlier, it's all your fault. See, now it all becomes about the boss or the other person. It's nothing that has to do with figuring out how do I feel about a different opinion or some feedback that my other boss wasn't giving me. And how do I begin to manage that? No, it's just, I'm going to start calling out work, calling out sick or taking days off. Or in some cases that are on that spectrum, like you said, who might even be a little more disturbed, can begin to completely collapse, and maybe need to take a leave of absence. It could go pretty far. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
All right. So what do we have so far? So we have a little bit of, we have a couple of different definitions right now of narcissism, right? We're beginning to distinguish between personality disorder to someone who has these traits and maybe has a little bit more flexibility. They're not so ossified in the way that they approach significant other people in their lives. And then one other thing that we didn't talk about yet, and maybe we could go into this in this next part of the conversation is How do these things, that happen early in development that you started to detail, right? The lack of attunement, there's not affective, right? That the parent may be using the child in some way for their own benefit.
Mhm.
How does this show up later in what we can say love or intimate relationships? Because that's really when things start to get more intense and you can see. And this is, I think, will bring us more directly into your work. And then how, I guess I would love to hear from you. How do you begin to help somebody? Like we can even follow that example that you started to detail, begin to separate, and not lose your voice, which is what you were indicating earlier, that your life may begin to shrink when you're with somebody like that. So what if we go in that direction next in the conversation? How does that feel?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now.